So I'm going to go to the Diencephalon, which is the next part of the brain that develops. Some people refer to this as the midbrain. But what does the Diencephalon do is that it is your motor regulation and motor memory. The Diencephalon is the seat of motor memory. When it's dysregulated, guess what happens? You have troubles encoding that stuff. You also begin to have what we lovingly call sensory integration problems. So when we have sensory integration problems, we see a lot of clumsiness, we see a lot of difficulty in learning, things like reading, recall. Dysgraphia is really a sensory integration problem where they have difficulty writing. Can these be problematic behaviors? Now we tend to hang labels on them, but really it has to do with how the Diencephalon is operating. An additional thing that the Diencephalon does for us is that it functions as a provoker and encourager of arousal, appetite, and sleep patterns. Some people actually refer to the Diencephalon in its total mix as the energy czar of the brain. I'll explain that a little bit more in just a second. But essentially, its job is to kind of trigger these kinds of mechanisms. Now, in addictive people, what's happening with arousal and appetite? It is being messed with. You bet it is. So let's kind of go to the next slide here. So people that have, for example, drugs that are triggering dopamine production. What's a drug that triggers dopamine production? Say this with me. All drugs of use trigger dopamine production. Dopamine is a Diencephalon mechanism. The reason that's dangerous is it's a non-conscious process. You're not thinking about it. You're just being triggered that you want that kind of experience. So these are the other. Does everybody know what the I can't even pronounce it today. The glutamate. That one right there on the end of the second line. But when it's out of whack, it does some really interesting things. It creates a situation where we will frequently have obesity, increased diabetes. And so I'm going to explain this mechanism in a minute. Here's what happens. When the Diencephalon is dysregulated, one of the things that it will do is tell you you are under a state of threat and you must preserve energy. Now, how are we going to preserve energy? In the human body, we have two ways of doing that. One is we are going to consume high-calorie fatty foods. That's one way. Way two is we're going to turn your thermostat way down so you don't burn it off. So when the Diencephalon has been dysregulated, we run into a lot of obesity that's related to these two mechanisms. Now, one of the problems with having that dysregulation occur is you feel kind of depressed. If your system is shutting down the threshold, what it's basically doing is saying, I'm not going to release any indigenous opiates into your system, or endorphins, because if you feel good, you'll move more, and you will burn calories, and I want you to save all of those. So what ends up happening is you end up with weight problems. And we're not talking about the person that's 20 pounds overweight. We're talking about obesity type of problems. Does that make sense? So that's a Diencephalon activity. In fact, if you want to read more about this, we frequently call this the mammal survival diet. All mammals, when they are in a state of survival, will bulk high-fat, high-calorie foods and reduce their movements as much as possible. That's just part of how they survive. And we, wonderful human beings who think we are so evolved from our cousins that are other mammals, we have the same mechanism in play. But we don't need to be, that herd of sheep that's in a drought and just needs to hang on to every calorie that they can. We get our stressors from interactions with the world around us, and they aren't of that natural variety. So let's go to the limbic system. This is the, if you will, the king of the primitive brain, or queen, depending on what your preference is. The limbic system is what we would sometimes call the amygdala system of the brain. It is charged with emotional regulation. Now, why is this important? Because it is the mechanism, it's the part of the brain that is involved in attachment, romance, feelings of connectedness, even friendship, are all driven out of the limbic system. It's set up to be the social connection between people. So if it's dysregulated, what might happen to the social connections people have? They can become chaotic. In fact, if they start early enough in children, we sometimes have an ugly name for that called attachment disorders. Attachment disorders generally relate to the limbic system being dysregulated. Now, the other piece of the limbic system is it's not, while it does have a memory function, it's not a serialized memory. When the limbic system, the memory in there is not serialized, it's emotional. So let me kind of give you a picture of what that does. So you have a little emotional experience out there, and maybe it's a pretty intense experience, and then you have another one, and you have another one. And what you end up doing, because this is not a serialized memory, but it's based on the stressors in the environment, what you end up doing is connecting these and saying, this means this. And sometimes this doesn't mean this. In fact, it frequently doesn't mean this. All we've done is taken, if you will, little islands afloat in a sea of emotion, and we've tied them together to make meaning out of whatever is being experienced. The danger with that is, of course, your experience isn't accurate because it's only based on those emotional islands. Now, the additional problem with that is a lot of people, particularly people that have addictive behaviors, tend to make most of their decisions emotionally. Which means that the information that they are basing those decisions on is this kind of stuff that's a mess. Does that make sense to folks? Because it's not a logical, reasonable, process. It's not based on serialized memory. It's based on these constructs that they have created from their emotional islands in their sea of emotion. This becomes kind of dangerous. We'll talk more about that in just a second. So that's one of the functions of the limbic system. Of course, it's tied into reproduction, sexual behavior, attachment. But the memory there is affect memory or emotional memory. Have you ever had a friend that just seemed to not be tuned in to what's going on around them? They've got some dysregulation. And I'm not talking about the occasional person that's absorbed in something else and they're just not paying attention. But it's like they live in this kind of unfocused way most of the time. One or all three of these systems has been dysregulated. Does that help? Okay. One of the problems is, particularly with children that are raised in these environments, and we're going to talk about the specific environments in a little bit, is the brain tends to build neural pathways, send those little proteins down there and create those dendrites. I was going to say neuroganglia, but I didn't. They create these wirings that become, instead of just a little thin fiber, become these big cables of communication. And that's a problem for us, because then they engage in these emotional behaviors rather than in more rational behavior giving.